One of the most difficult things when learning to read out loud is the Sheva, distinguishing between the vocal Sheva and the silent Sheva, where the Masoretes use the same symbol for both circumstances. First, we'll consider several rules for the vocal Sheva. When a Sheva appears under the first letter of a word, it's vocal. Bereshit, in the beginning. When there's two Sheva in a row, the second Sheva will be vocal. Yishratsu, let them swarm. When a Sheva appears under a strong dagesh, as we have here, Hagadolim, then it's vocal. Now we know this is a strong dagesh, even though it's in a Bagad Kafat letter, because the dagesh comes after a vowel, the patak, Hagadolim. So it's a vocal Sheva. When we have a Sheva after a long vowel, it's vocal. Uravu, let them fill. And in another circumstance, even though Kametz Yod is not technically a long vowel, it's a diphthong, still the diphthong functions like a long vowel. So we have hayata, and there were. When you have a Sheva between two of the same letter, this is also a circumstance in which it's a vocal Sheva. Hineni, because if it weren't, the Masoretes would just put the noon with a dagesh in it to show the two noons. But because they're separated, it has to be a vocal Sheva. Another circumstance is when you have a Sheva before a Bagad Kafat letter, and there's no dagesh in the Bagad Kafat letter, like we have here. So we don't have a dagesh in the Gimel, which means it has to be a vocal Sheva. So it's functioning like a vowel to take away the dagesh lene. So we have here bidagat, over the fish of. So this shows us one of the important reasons why we need to know the difference between a dagesh lene and a dagesh forte. Now we'll go over several circumstances where we have a silent Sheva. First, when there is a Sheva after a short vowel, it's a silent Sheva. Mavdil, to divide between. Mavdil. And we have a second indicator that this is a silent Sheva because there is a dagesh lene in the dalet. Because if it was a vocal Sheva, that would take the dagesh lene away. But because the dagesh lene is still there in the Bagad Kafat letter, therefore we know that's a second indicator that this is a silent Sheva. Another way is when the Sheva is the last in the last letter of a word, betoch, in the midst, then it's silent if it's in the last letter of a word. Or again, when there's two Sheva consecutive, the first one is silent. Yishratsu, let them swarm. So the first one will be silent, the second one will be vocal. Yishratsu. So here you can see that in this word there's a short vowel, and so that's another reason why it would be a silent Sheva. Here are several examples from Genesis 1, verses 3 and following. You have three examples of vocal Sheva in verse 3. you have the Hatuf Sagol in Elohim, and the Yahi, the Shva, is under the first letter of the word, so it's vocal. And then there's the diphthong, I, Vaya, which functions as a long vowel, which makes that a vocal Shva. So this whole verse then is Vayehi Elohim, Yahi Or, Vayehi Or. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. Now in verse 4, there are, looks like 5 different Shva. First, there's the Shva in Vayar. I got that wrong. Vayar, that's a silent Shva because it's after the Ptak. Then there's the Elohim with a vocal Shva. Then we have the silent Shva in Vayavdel, and it's silent because it comes after a Ptak, which is a short vowel. Then we have another vocal Shva. It's a Hatuf Sagol Shva. And then finally, we have a silent Shva because it's in the last letter of a word, Hoshach. So verse 4, putting it together, Vayar Elohim, and God saw, Et Haor Ki Tov, that it was good. Vayavdel Elohim, and God separated, Bein Haor Uvein HaChoshech, between the light and between the dark. Now in verse 5 we have a number of vocal Shva, Elohim, Shva, the Hatuf Sagol Shva is under the first letter of the word, so it's vocal. Then here we have Valachoshech, because the Shva is under the first letter of the word, it's vocal. Then there's also some, there's another vocal Shva here. Again, we have Vayehi, the Shva is after a diphthong, twice. And there's some silent Shva in this verse. Here we have silent because it's after the Hirik, which is a short vowel. Vayikra. Or again, we have the Shva in the last letter of the word, so that makes it silent. Valachoshech. And then there's one rather difficult circumstance in all of this, and that's this exception here. Because even though there's the diphthong with kametz yod, which normally functions as a long vowel, which would make that a vocal Shva, this is an exception. The nature of the word Lila, night, it's just a exception to the rule. You just kind of have to know in this case. There's not a lot of exceptions, but when you do have one like this, you just learn Lila. Even though it should be by rule a vocal Shva, it's not. It's a silent Shva. So let's read this last verse then. Vaikra Elohim laor yom, and God called the light day. V'lachoshech kara laila, and the darkness he called night. Vayhi erev, and there was evening. Vayhi voker, and there was morning. Yom echad, one day. Again, take your time working on the Shva. This doesn't come all at once. There's a lot of different rules, but it's worth taking the time early on to learn them, to learn how to read out loud. Besides reading out loud, So it'll be very important for a number of grammatical issues which will come up. There's no easy way out the Sheva, but take the rules and lay them out and slowly work through figuring out each Shva, whether it's silent or vocal, as you go along.